My first encounter into vortex healing was when I was in a lot of pain. I came to a vortex healing practitioner and she gave me to hold two crystals. In that stage of life, I will not say I was a completely believer of everything that coming into my direction. And I remember holding those two crystals and just feeling electricity coming from them. I was remembering opening my eyes and trying to see if those crystals have kind of metal or something that could project that energy. And that was my first encountering with vortex healing. Since then I was being fortunate to learn some of the tools, and I'm very, very, very excited about the opportunity to talk to Ric today. More than the healing, which was important, I think the conversation about inviting people to listen behind their words, to listen not always with their mind, with the other part of their system, and to try to look behind that cover and see if there is something more connected and clear that exists over there. And perhaps remembering that healing is not only something we are doing, is also something we can surrender into, or something that can flow through us. And let's start with the first question. Tell us a little bit about your story. How did you discover that healing modality?
Okay, well, it's a good bit of a story. In the year I was graduating college, my father died and my mother went into a black hole, and I, was sort of shook to my foundations and couldn't handle it. And so I left and went to Europe to hitchhike around. I also had asthma at the time, and I left my asthma medication behind. I was going to go cold turkey off it. And when I would eat, it would bring me more into my body, and I would feel the asthma. I'd feel all the emotional trauma there. And so I basically starved. I got way, way out of body. And for years, I was actually in this deep starvation mode. And one day, I was walking around all day carrying a backpack and took a bite of a tomato at the end of the day. And I got a rush like I just shot some stimulant drug up my system. And that's how low my blood sugar got. And so I was in starvation for a very long time and very bad shape, um, way out of body. And I started to, get involved. Well, I'd started to do meditation, and in that starved state, my nervous system got very refined, so I could really feel how just different foods, different thoughts, different energies would move through my system. It was the beginning of a whole other line of experience for me. And when I was in Europe, I would just hitchhike all day. Wherever I'd end up, I'd find a farmer's field to sleep in and pick up. So I was just riding this wave of wherever life took me. And eventually, to make a long story short, I ended up in Tucson, Arizona. And there was a psychic surgeon from the Philippines coming through town, and I joined. I signed up to see the person. In the waiting room, I met a woman who was practicing Jin Shin Jitsu, and so we agreed we would do a trade. Now the thing is, I really had nothing to trade, so I had to make something up. and I made up this aura balancing technique, which actually became my first book. And it sort of blew her out of the water. She wanted to turn me into a guru. I said, no, I'm in no shape to be anybody's guru. um, um, and um, and through Jinshin, I ended up meeting another woman who ended up dating. Um, she loved the work and decided I needed to teach it. She was going to organize the workshop from her friends, and I taught it. And that class became my first book, which got translated into 7 languages. Your hands can heal, including Hebrew. Probably not in print anymore. Um, and
You need to work on it. It's a
yeah,
good book.
so I eventually became a full-time healer, and there's a whole story behind that. I won't get into right now. Um, and um, and one day, when I would sleep in a new place, I would need to clear it first, okay? Because all of whatever's gone on in that room is imprinted into the room, and in a hotel room into the bed. And for instance, once I was tired, arrived at a hotel and didn't clear the room. I lay down. There was this 3D movie of what just transpired the night before in the bed. You know, do I sit up and clear it? Do I watch the movie, fall asleep to the movie? Anyway, so I used to just spread my field out through the space, pushing, stuff out. And it was kind of inefficient and slow. And one day I remembered I had this past life connection to this magical energy that I could just pull on and just intended to go and clear the space. And it would do it, and it would do it really fast and really magically, really well. And one day I was at my mother's house for Thanksgiving, I think it was, and I went to pull on this energy to clear the room I was going to sleep in. And it was like it opened this trap door in creation when my feet were still on the ground. And the rest of me was out in this huge interdimensional vortex. And this voice started to talk to me out of the vortex, which was this avataric, this divine being that we call Merlin. Um, and not the Merlin from King Arthur times. He was a regular human like me, a teacher in the lineage. And and so this voice said I had studied this in 2 past lives. It was time to start using it again. And it reactivated the transmissions I had from back then. And suddenly I was having these amazing healings that I couldn't have had before. One of my, next week, I had a client come in who had chronic fatigue for 20 years, did Jinshin Jitsu every day to keep the symptoms down, but he never could get rid of it. One session, it was gone. I went to India to see Papaji, and um, he would sort of point me to people, like one guy had acute leukemia, was getting blood transfusions every week or two. After the third session, well, I saw it as a subclinical virus in his bone marrow was the real issue. Knocked that out, and over the next month, um, all of his blood indicators returned to normal. So people were seeing this kind of thing and wanting to learn it. I hardly knew how I was doing it, but we set up a test class, and here we are. It worked.
I'm kind of curious how, and it's okay if it will take time to figure out the word for it, but first of all, how do you model what you are doing, or what was the process of discovering or developing what you already did with that voice? And the
Well,
other thing is
mhm.
what,
Well, in my those dark years, eventually I got connected to Neem Karoli Baba, which is Ram Dass's guru and Krishna Das's guru, and that's a story in itself. Um, and And at some point, I realized that a major stress in everyone's life is just the process of the ego having to make decisions. And, even little decisions for ego, the ego, which is never secure, every decision is life and death in some way, right? Um, and I decided at first as kind of a game to see what it would be like if I let Baba make decisions for me. And at the time I used the pendulum. I'd never been able to use them, but I asked them to take over the pendulum and then I would get clear answers from them. And so there was this process, this evolving process of just surrendering to the divine that became an integral part of my life. Because after just like a week of doing this, a friend noticed this huge amount of stress had come out of my system. And so it was obvious even to the outside. And that just became a way of life. And then once um, this event happened that reconnected me to this Merlin lineage, then I started to do that in relation to the divine being or the divine expression that we refer to as Merlin that powers that lineage. And so my ongoing process, my modeling has basically been surrendering, all decisions to this, to hearing, feeling what I get from this being and from divinity and just following it wherever that takes me. So that's my modeling that. In terms of what I've learned, I couldn't even begin to tell you. But it just keeps, it just becomes an easy path because whatever it is, you just keep surrendering. This is what life has brought you, and you trust it, and you just keep surrendering to it. And that keeps deepening your connection to divinity. And through that process, new things keep coming into the lineage. Um, um, and because my own system was so messed up on that level, plus I was tortured in my last life. I came in with a whole bunch of shut down places, and a lot of the karma around all that went into allergies. And so as I worked on my own system, both physically and emotionally and spiritually, that I keep getting shown new things to be able to move along with that. And that becomes new things I can teach students. So that becomes the process of, my process, you might say, is the becomes the blueprint for teaching others. So I don't really feel so much like a teacher, like a guide. I've been given guidance for how to go down the path, and I'm just sharing that as I go along.
I bet it's a lot of stories, but some stories about insight that came through that, or a decision that you needed to do and how it went.
Um, yeah, again, it's so I've recently written a book. It's not published yet. I still need to do one more read through of all these different stories from my life. It'll be called Swimming in Eternity. Um, but okay, let's see an example. Um, well, a very simple example is just with scheduling. Um, um, should I give this class? Should I give that class? How long should this class be? Um, how long will it take to, finish the transmission? How many days should we, stay practicing it and so on? Christian Das does a week-long retreat in Costa Rica in early January. Should I go? Shouldn't I go? And um, so, or I can run into someone like, for instance, I ran into a woman at the Omega Institute who was bipolar. She, I tend to attract people who start telling me what's going on with their systems. And so I look and I can see I can see why she's bipolar. The question is, in that moment, is it appropriate to offer insight into it or to help her with it or not? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. In her case, it was, and um, I worked on her for maybe 5 minutes. It actually was a pretty easy fix for her, and she hasn't had an episode ever since. Um, but depending on what her karma might have been, maybe I would have gotten a no, to not say anything, just to listen and be with her and move on. You know, I don't try to decide those things from a mind or an ego level. I just trust the divine guidance that I get and I follow that, and things unfold the way they need to unfold.
I kind of want to ask, I know you wrote an article about it, about how to surrender or how to listen, what we need to take out of the way for it to be able to, I want to say, be manifest like that, or
Yeah, I understand your question. Um, I don't know that one can teach surrender. Um, it like one has to sort of come to that. One could keep looking for it. One could keep making oneself available for that process. Um, but the ego instinctively tends to have resistance. It doesn't want to let go of control. It's deep, deep, genetically wired survival stuff to stay in control. And surrender means giving up control. Um, and to trusting some higher level. So often people have to go through something like I did, um, uh, to be willing to, give it up to, a higher level of one's own being, which ultimately is divinity, to let divinity be the guide. Um, so, you see people kind of partly doing it, but that doesn't mean you can't get guidance. So, like in our foundational class, we teach students how to get kind of yes and no answers from Roland. So, for instance, the simplest thing is for them would be to, and other people can try this with whatever connection to divinity they have, is to fill their whole being and their system with that divinity, and then you ask a question, and you're inside, and if the answer is a yes, that divinity brightens, and if it's a no, then that sense of divinity dims. And so in that way, one can, one doesn't have to be in a surrendered place to do that. One just has to you know um, uh, perceive. One just has to be able to perceive if divinity is within you, if it brightens or darkens. And there are other ways to do that. Maybe someone keeps their head still, and yes is like this and no is like that. But you have to start with the connection to divinity, so that divinity is giving you the indication. If you're just doing it in your head, then you're going to get something that could be way off. So you start with a connection with the divinity, and you let that kind of inform you.
I'm curious about a little bit about the process of awakening. I think you downloaded in the book a map, but how does that
Yeah,
process is carrying if you have any suggestion to people that want to go that path?
yeah. So there are different routes for it. Um, with vortex healing, what happens is that one has to get ripe for awakening before one can awaken. Right? And so there's a process involved, and it's not simply an emotional process. It's we come in with these issues from past life. I call them karmic issues, and they show up in the spine in these little dots, in the karmic body. In these dots we call karma knots. So before awakening can happen, um, all those karma knots need to be cleared. Now, tastes of awakening can happen. I had a taste of awakening long before I woke up. on my first LSD trip. Um, but when I was like 17 or something. Um, but so these cosmonauts need to go, and then whatever opening that creates needs to go deeper, and that needs to go deeper, and we have a whole map of that. And then at some point, the system becomes ripe for awakening, and so we have certain classes that students are required to take before they can take what we call the core veil class. And those classes, the divine source of our lineage, gets people to the place where they are ripe by the time they hit that last class before the core veil class. And then in the core veil class, again, the divinity within the lineage has made it so that with everyone being ripe, it becomes possible for everyone to actually have this basic awakening, which we call losing the core veil. Um, Everyone loses that on the first day, and then the rest of the class we go through, we deepen that. So how people do that on their own, um, I mean, like with Buddhism, it's this very long-term process of purification, with breath and becoming detached from thoughts, and you know, and um, um, it's critical whether you're vortex healing or some other path. It's critical that you're working with someone who is awake, because that awakeness becomes the bridge for your system to either pattern or, some teachers are better at bridging their awakeness than others. So a teacher like Adishanti is very good at kind of, you might say, communicating his awakeness. I'm not talking about in words, but a direct communication of that awakeness to people who've attended his talks. He's good at bridging that to them, and that starts to transform their consciousness in a way that their mind cannot do. Um, I've seen other teachers where they're not bridging at all. They're just sitting there in their own awake space, and it becomes up to the students to have to try to pattern whatever is awake there. And so that's very, very slow. And, so you've got, human awake beings like myself and Arishanti, and you've got avatars, like Amma, Neem Karoli Baba, and so on, um, who you can work with even if they're no longer alive. Um, Christ, of course, Jesus, um, but it's there are people that wake up without a teacher, absolutely, because however they came in this life, they're already pretty ripe, and so from that place, they can wake up, in any moment, you know, if they're ripe. But for most people, they need teachers, and I've always found, for me, it was helpful to have both a regular human teacher and divine teacher or divine teachers. Um, so the advantage of the human teacher is that they have a human karmic energy system that has become awake, and your own system then can pattern into that. Where you can't do that with someone like Amma or Neem Karoli Baba, because their system is completely different. You start to tune into them, and it's like just empty and everywhere. But they are the living embodiment of the absolute truth, and and freedom. And so, having both, and I had both, to me was tremendously valuable. Even for like when I first woke up, it was a very schizoid reality for me. There was this, all the leftover, all the old conditioning was still there in the head. I called it the eye in the head. And the eye in the head couldn't figure out what was going on because something had completely changed in the heart into this place of just beingness. And and that place is a no eye zone. So the eye in the head couldn't figure it out. And it would get quiet enough, it would drop down into the heart, but it would lose its sense of I there, pop back into the head, and it's like, what was that? What was that? So it was this kind of schizoid reality for about a year. And then I went to see Adi Shanti and I asked him about it. He smiled and said, only a year, um, which was actually very reassuring. Um, um, so, I'm not going to have that from, a divine teacher, but I'll have that from that kind of feedback. And then he said, um, whatever expectations I might have about the nature of awakening would be the thing that would get in the way of awakening deeper. And so again, from his own understanding, his own process, he can share, and that can be very valuable. Plus, his own awakeness, again, becomes like a blueprint for others, to do that. Unfortunately, he's no longer teaching actively. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
There is a gap between human teacher to animals teacher on that level, and how much language is a barrier to, because you said the belief or the I created a gap.
Well, the expectation of how things should be can create a barrier because you keep trying to squeeze your life into how you think. You keep trying to squeeze your consciousness into how you think it should look. Um, so the awakeness was already there, but he was warning me against trying to, you know, mold it
Yeah.
into a particular shape. Um, Now, animals, and you're particularly aligned with horses. Um, so I had the opportunity um, before no, the early days of Vortex Healing. I dated a veterinarian who worked mostly with horses, and when she was having problems with a horse, she would call me in. And so I had a chance to work with a bunch of horses, which was a wonderful experience. Um, um, they're not awake in what we talk about in terms of awakening. They're not awake. They're definitely living in their own ego consciousness, but they're living more. There's less of a certain kind of separation that humans have. They're more in like kind of a group field, um, and but they're definitely more grounded, and they're definitely a lot less mental than we are. So one time I merged my consciousness into one of the horses I was working on, and I was and the trainer was coming walking towards us, and I could see through the horse's eyes how human beings looked to them, um, and we looked like this kind of almost like this balloon of noise, attached by a thread to legs that were walking. So they're much more in just beingness, but that beingness is still very much an ego state. But because of there's also that beingness there, they can help people to kind of get out of their heads. They can't help people to wake up per se, um, because they're not awake. But
There
the
was a difference between the first. I'm curious about the energetic system of people and horses, and then the level of development of different horses spiritually.
yeah, they're not all that developed spiritually. They're really not. Um, Again, they have more beingness because they haven't. It's like in the incarnational journey, um, you start with simpler kinds of consciousness and evolve into where you have all these issues, right? And then it becomes like too much, and then the journey starts back the other way. So, like in terms of karma knots that we talked about, like a typical cat or dog maybe has like four karma knots. So that sounds very evolved, where because a typical human has like 250. Um, so it makes it seem like the cat or the dog is much more evolved, but they're actually in the early stages of still acquiring more karma nuts. They're still on the uphill climb, and they need to get there before they can start coming back down. So they need um, so um, so again, dogs, cats, horses, they all have less mentality, and so with that mind being more quiet, there's more beingness there. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're more evolved. They're just, they're still developing, complexity in their ego consciousness. And their energy systems, are similar enough. You know, um, they have spines, they have chakras, they have nervous systems, they have a brain, um, and they certainly have emotional issues. Um, I worked on one horse who was very skittish. He'd been a wild horse actually in another life and had been mistreated by humans and was very skittish around them. There was another horse that they're having issues with, and it was really a simple thing. That horse just needed to really go out and run. They needed to run that horse every day. Um, but then there was one horse I worked on that whenever they would try to train it, it would go lame. And my veterinarian friend, called me in, and I could see that it had had fluid in its lungs when it was born, and it impacted its lung in some way, so that when it would try to run, it would create this twist in its system, and it would go lame. And I cleared the lung, and they were able to then train the horse. Um, uh, you tune into older male horses in particular, you know, they feel, I don't even have the emotional word for it, but they can feel like they don't have it anymore in the same way they had it. And there's a certain negativity, that can
Yeah.
come in. Yeah. Um, so, so very similar in a lot of ways, but still fairly early in in the stages of evolution of egoic consciousness.
So it's accumulating and then releasing, and that's impacted the process.
Right.
I, I have something regard to I was stuck in the other side of a river in Costa Rica and was close to not coming back from there. And being near death, what is the experience for people? How does it support or change our?
Well, different people have different experiences, first of all. Um, and for a lot of people, um, they come back and they feel a lot safer because, there's this core fear of death. And here they've sort of died, and in the death experience, there's usually a lot of light. And, um, there, some people say that they met their relatives, although I don't know that they're really meeting their relatives, but that's their experience, and that they feel at peace and so on. And so, um, so take it can take the fear of death out of their lives, which is very significant. Um, some of them can perceive that what really matters is how well that they've loved in their life, and that changes things considerably. For me, I had a near death experience, but I didn't have any of that. Make a long story short, it was a car wreck. Um, and I'd had a premonition about it. Like a week before, I'd written a poem for my father who had already journeyed through. And as we were about to crash, I wasn't driving. Something in me recognized it and said, "Oh, this is it." And I tore out through my body before even waiting for it to crash. I looked down at the body. It seemed like I had a choice as to whether to go back or not. And I chose not to. So I started going. I don't even know where I was headed, but I was going away from the body. I guess I was going towards the light. And these two beings caught up to me and tried to convince me to go back. And I was not convinced. Um, And to compress a long story, um, at some point, they said, if everything's been set up for your life and to be able to, do certain things. And if you go back, all of your karmas can be released in this life. I went, huh. And in that pause, Merlin dragged, I hadn't even met Merlin yet, but he's back there guiding things. And Merlin dragged me back into my body. Um, it's like my resistance to leaving stopped in that moment. And in that pause, he dragged me back in. It was kind of funny because it was like this dark, damp, almost like damp space, and my body wasn't like sticking to me, and I was like wriggling around trying to get it to stick to me, kind of like Peter Pan trying to get a shadow to stick to himself with soap. And finally it stuck and I was awake and um I was in shock. Um like my buddy was with me and I couldn't remember who he was, only this vague sense that I knew this being, and you know, and then I was in the hospital and found myself writing another like 10 pages of that poem I'd started a week ago. Um, and so I think these experiences are different for different people and they can have different kinds of impacts on their life. And I think that, the vast majority of them are very positive in terms of what people take away from it and how it changes the way that they live.
Interesting. There's another something that's coming up to me to ask about sensitivity.
Sensitivity?
Yeah, you describe yourself with psychic sensitivity, with if you have any advice or offering regard to how to navigate life with sensitivity.
How to navigate life with sensitivity. Well, I don't see that. Um, it depends on what we mean by sensitivity. Like, there are people who um, are very reactive, very sensitive in the sense that they react very strongly to everything. Um, that's different than just simply being able to sense. So you're talking about people who are very reactive to things?
Yeah,
Okay. So,
I'm talking about both in a way. Both are relevant to me, but let's
okay.
start with this.
Okay. So, there are certain energetics in the nervous system that can make people, um, where their nervous systems are more like, edgy. And, the best thing for that really is for them to see a high level vortex healer and have their nervous systems worked on. Because we have protocols for that that can really just soothe a lot of that down. Um, then, like step two is looking at whatever emotional stuff might be behind it. Now, sometimes people are born with nervous systems that are depleted in certain ways, and that makes them more reactive because they don't have a certain strength to them, right? And so for some people, it's not necessarily emotionally based, and other people, it's much more strongly emotionally based. But before anything else, the first thing I would do is actually start to kind of retune the nervous system, um, and uh, and the etheric body becomes very important in that it's like connected to the nervous system and it's your boundary between you and the world. One thing, and this isn't always the case, but one thing that comes into play for many people with uh, nervous systems that need help is that there's often like a deep codependence factor behind it, or at least sometimes. So what happens is codependence makes the person want to merge. So then they start to merge with whoever they're interacting with, but then they feel vulnerable because they've taken their buffer and they've stretched it out. So then they contract, but now they feel isolated, so they want to merge, and this push pull can actually create holes in the etheric body. Those holes will make person much, much more reactive. And we can fix those very easily when there are holes in the etheric body. Um, but it's, yeah, so that's one thing that can do that. But again, there are other factors. There's just the physical nervous system. There's other kinds of emotional things where maybe a person's been abused. There's a ridiculous amount of childhood abuse that happens in the world. And so that already makes you defensive. And that defensiveness, affects the nervous system and, makes you more on edge because you don't feel safe. You can't relax. You know, all encounters become, potential threats in the back of your mind because you don't know who's going to abuse you and who isn't. So there's a lot of different ways that that plays out. Um, for sensing, for just sensing, um, for me, going through the world isn't any different than it was before. And, I just notice more about where people's consciousness is. Same way that someone who's maybe, you know, um, uh, taken a class in plants, they walk through the forest and they notice more than they did before, you know. And so, certain things will just jump out at me and I can't help but notice them. Other things I need to tune into to notice. But I'm basically going through the world in the same way on that level. It doesn't change the way that I move through the world. For some few people, it does. Some people can't shut it off, or um, um, or they they're in a place where they don't just notice, but they have all kinds of inner reactivity that comes into play around what they notice, and then they need to deal with their inner reactivity. The problem isn't that they're noticing, it's that they've got all these reactivity issues.
You spoke about the child abuse. Like, I have a question regard to if there are, I don't know if it's energetic structure or there is a way to do work collectively.
Um, yeah, but it's very slow. I mean, the Vortex Healing Lineage twice a year has these earth shifts, we call them, where we do global work. Um, um, and, trying to release certain kinds of patterns in the general human psyche, on a global level. We'll have, 400 or 500 students gather together from around the world and we have a relationship with the angelic realm. Angels will come in to support what we're doing. Um, Actually, an angel will come into each student's spine for the time that they're channeling, but it's very slow and the light can also stir up the darkness, just as it can in individuals. So whatever the path is, it seems to be for humanity. It's you know we're all part of its process and doing what we can, but at the same time, it's like there's a current that's moving along in a certain direction, and I don't think life as we know it is sustainable indefinitely, and so at some point, there has to be a crash, whether that's from a pandemic that makes COVID look like a common cold, or whether it's from something with AI. Um, gets AI has gotten to the place where it can just infiltrate almost everything, and some rogue state gets hold of that level of AI and then crashes the whole global infrastructure. I mean, there are a lot of different ways that can come down, or a sun flare that blows out the electrical grid across the planet. But it just feels like however humanity is living right now is not sustainable, and at some point it has to crash. And that crash, will be part of the karma and part of the path of humanity, because how we come out of that is going to be different than how we were, going in. Just like near-death experiences, coming out, people are changed. They're different when they come back.
We are going to doesn't have to be event, but it's going to be shifted the way that's how it feels too.
Yeah, I think it's going to be some global event. I think for it to shift, it needs to be a global event that affects everyone across the board in a profound way. Everyone that's left, anyway.
Do you think there is I want to say, better way of preparing or a global event, before global event, after global event? It's impacted energetically. Spoke about solar flares.
Well, I mean, it's always advised to have some spare canned food and water around. But that stuff is only going to last so long. Um, and some people, you know, um, end up acquiring guns for that kind of thing. For me, I just wouldn't want that kind of energy in my house. You know, I'd rather be killed than be in a position where I'm suddenly killing somebody else.
Yeah.
Um, 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 but I think the best thing we can do is just to keep evolving ourselves spiritually as best as we can, and um, to recognize that we're all in this together.
Yeah, let's go back to what you said about the animals. At least in that aspect, they are different. Like something maybe we can take from them.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, they just have quieter minds, which make them more peaceful.
I have a question about like all of that work with karma. How can you, from one side, can do work that's clearing karma, working with karma, impacted?
Well, there's different kinds of karma. So there's the most well-known thought of kind of karma is what we call karma of events. And that means is, I hurt someone else hurts me. What goes around comes around. And so whatever I've done, the universe remembers it. And at some point, it doesn't have to be in this life, it comes back. That kind of karma, um, you can't work with it. It's just there. You can become detached from it. So, for instance, I had killed my father in a past life, and that car accident, in which I also broke my right shoulder, where I died and came back, was the playing out of that karma. I killed him, I died, but I came back. I was brought back for another purpose. Um, and I always had trouble with this right shoulder afterwards. But because I could recognize it was my karma, I didn't have any resentment around it or any victim stuff around it. It was like, okay, this is my payback. So accepting one's karma, brings you to peace with certain difficult situations in one's life that are karma playing out. Because that kind of karma, there's nothing much we can do with it. Um, um, but we can accept it. We can just let it be what it is. But usually that karma is mixed in with what we call karma of conditioning. So let's say I get angry at someone. On the one hand, that anger goes out into the world and becomes something that eventually comes back to me. But it also goes inward and conditions my own system with the anger. So now I have not just karma of it, but I've got inner conditioning. And that conditioning is going to make it more likely for me to get angry the next time, right? And so that kind of karma, the karma of conditioning, we can work with. That's the big part of what we're doing in vortex healing was releasing conditioning, physical conditioning, mental conditioning, emotional conditioning, that keeps us stuck in certain patterns, right? So that's a kind of karma, that conditioning. And that kind of karma worked with. And the other kind, all you can do is actually, again, coming back to surrender, is to surrendering to it is what it is. I mean, let's say, you're born with, with, with some major issue in your body. Um, um, that's going to be karma playing out, and um, there's just not. I mean, certain things may be fixable on a medical level, but certain things aren't. And what are you going to do? You can resent it. So again, this is where your conditioning too, and your spiritual evolution comes in. You can resent it. You can use that resentment as a way of your foundation of relating to the world, feeling victimized and so on. And in which case you'll probably end up victimizing other people, through your sense of being a victim, and or through clearing your karma of conditioning and evolving yourself spiritually, you can recognize that this is your karma and you're going to do the best that you can in this life from a heartful place in spite of whatever's going on for your system.
So there is a choice. It's a partly choice, but the conditioning side of it is something that we can work with or do something with it.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And part of working with that is that it becomes really important to understand how the body's energetic system works. So we've mapped out things that I haven't seen anywhere else. An example, coming back to the woman who had the bipolar. So we have these lines, I call them divine lines, different kinds of energy pathways. So there are these divine lines that come out the hands, the feet, and each chakra, and the chakra spins on them. So one of those, but those lines can become broken. And if a chakra line becomes broken, then the chakra goes dead because there's nothing to spin on. So in this particular case, the woman through a trauma had broken the line in her left, coming out of her left foot. So that divine line coming out of the left foot, you might say, kind of organizes all this other energy that's coming into the leg and going back out. And so all that becomes disrupted, backs up into the brain, disrupting her brain. And now she's got bipolar. But it's not really an emotional condition, although it may seem like it is. It started with an emotional trigger, which was that trauma. But what she's got is actually energetically a broken divine line, and however the brain has been messed up from that. So fixing that broken divine line, takes maybe 20 seconds, and then I spent a few minutes, kind of catching up her brain and energy system to, kind of that fix of the broken line, and she looked completely different, felt completely different, and again hasn't had an episode since. So part of working with the conditioning is not just emotional conditioning, but understanding, what's going on. Another example is years and years ago, I gave a public talk on group healing, and I could feel that there was a broken divine line in the group. And so I mentioned it and I fixed it and then did the group healing for everyone else. I didn't stop to see where it was or who it was or anything. A month later, I got a letter. It was long enough ago, people wrote letters from a guy who was at the healing who had these stomach issues for like 20 years and had learned some healing practice to keep it calm, but had never gotten rid of it. But ever since that healing, his stomach issues were gone. And so that was the broken line. He had a broken line in his third chakra, which messed up his stomach. And, and so that 20-second fix, was actually all that he needed, to heal that. And So, um, so conditioning is like on different levels. There's the emotional conditioning, mental conditioning, and there's the whole, however the energetics have been affected by that, or however the energetics have created emotional conditioning. So a person can come in with a like a weak constitutional kidney energy. Um, uh, Almost everyone that I've met that has an autoimmune disease has come in with a weak constitutional kidney energy. So, um, um, so viruses live in weak kidney energy, and so they come in. That's already weak, sets them up, and that's also part of their karma. Though, sets them up. They end up getting a disease later, and depending what their karma is, maybe they find vortex healing or a vortex healer who can, bring up their weak kidney energy and knock out that virus um, and restore them to health. And sometimes, their karma isn't that, and they're just stuck with that condition. Um, there's all kinds of people with conditions out there that we can be of enormous help with, but it's not their karma to find us. So that's just where it is.
So, so it's taken care by the lineage, you say, or by the divine, like who is coming into my path regard to that. Because I wanted to ask about money, like,
Now I'm saying that it requires, for a lot of those things, I mean, there are some things that can be dealt with just on a therapist level, but most things just require something deeper. And so, for a lot of people, being in touch with a high level vortex healer and getting sessions, is really what they need to kind of help. But they also need to be, you might say, participating in the process as opposed to just, fix me, you know, um, and having their own consciousness kind of being aligned with the process is not always, but more often than not important.
and do you think money is helpful on that regard, or sometimes it's not relevant? Like the exchange creating the ability to receive?
Um, well, money is important because without it, you can't hire, you know, um, you can't get healing sessions typically.
Yeah.
Um, you can't often afford to see a therapist. Um, and if your money issues go a little deeper, then you don't even have time for spiritual work because you're too busy just keeping up. Um, so you know so um, so money can be an important factor for a lot of people. People who have it take it for granted, and people who don't have it, that becomes like an important struggle for them. Now sometimes people who don't have it because they have issues around money. um, uh, so I've seen where um, for instance, like I have certain food allergies. My bodies react to it. Energetically, there's something that doesn't match on a vibrational level, let's say. So I've had various people come to me with wondering about their money issues, and not all of them, but a certain percentage of them. If I tune in, it's almost as if they have an allergy to money. Vibrationally, they resist it. They're not going to have much inflow if they're resisting it coming in. I'm not saying that's always the case. I'm just saying that in a certain percentage, well, I don't know, maybe 15, 20%, um, there's an emotional issue there. So things come from different angles, and and part of the beauty of vortex healing is that we look at it from all these different angles.
It's a modality that stayed wide in a way. That's that's amazing. And I think by the mechanism you describe about the surrender, stay in the divine side of it, even though it's impacted. Like I'm remembering a question from therapy that I got in Vortex, that she asked like, what is the next step we need to address? And then the divine energy will take care of it. But like the direction is a divine direction. Wow. Thank you so, so, so much. It was an amazing experience for me, and I think people can take a lot out of it.
Good. Thank you. It was lovely.
I'm not sure it's even doable to describe those ideas in words, but we did the best that we can. And if you like it, you are more than welcome to share it, to comment it, to sign up for the other chapters. I think it's more than right thing to do to go and read Ric's books about awakening behind the veil, One Heart Laughing, Your Hands Can Heal You, and A Magical Path. I got a lot of those books, and I think they can contribute a lot to you also.